curious, you're saying that Huawei was also doing something similar?
Yes, so Huawei came up in a number of countries as, I would say, both doing the propaganda side, but actually the censorship side of some of this as well. Some of it was paying commentators behind the scenes, these junkets for journalists from the US, but also for other countries. Huawei would sponsor them to come to, their facilities in China and talk through how great it was and, questioning whether they're actually under the control of the CCP or not. But they were actually pretty aggressive also in kind of more censorship and intimidation. In France, there was an example of, say, a French researcher on a show kind of like this and saying that Huawei was actually controlled by the CCP and had close ties to the CCP. And Huawei went and actually sued her for defamation and then sued the local television producers. And that court case went on. It was dropped very recently, but went on for like 3 years. So that really kind of creates, again, this type of chilling effect about what you can or can't say about a company that is very important in telecom infrastructure internationally. And there's very clear evidence that they have close ties to the CCP.
Well,
So
I mean,
what you're
I think
saying-
it's just ridiculous. Just because someone talks about the very clear superiority of Huawei phones and tech and really what they could do for America's 5G network, just because they acknowledge this, I mean, that doesn't mean they're being paid behind the scenes by this independent Chinese company
That
that's
has
private.
absolutely no ties to the CCP.
Exactly.
Yeah, they just censor things that are anti-CCP completely of their own accord, because that's what you would do.
And not because they're worried that Huawei is going to pull their advertisements either, which we saw something, threats along those lines happening.
Absolutely. Anyways, this episode is sponsored by Huawei.
Exactly.
Join the 5G network.
And don't forget Alibaba too. They're sponsoring all kinds of newsletters on the Hill and stuff like that too.
Really?
Really?
Oh.
Well, tell us about that.
We didn't look as much at closely at Alibaba because it didn't come up as often, but they're also a company in the US context, especially that, you see these sponsorships. If you ever read the Hill newsletter, it's a Congress and, it's like an electronic newsletter. And then you'll see kind of sponsored by Alibaba on some issues.
Well, I think that one of the interesting things here is you've mentioned a whole bunch of different kinds of countries, like Kenya, Romania, the United States. And I know Freedom House lists countries by, free, partly free, mostly free, not free. What were you finding? Which kind of countries is China targeting more heavily?
That's a good question. So in this particular study, we looked at 30 countries and they are all rated free or partly free by Freedom House. And we kind of gave each country 2 sets of scores in the way that Freedom House likes to create these rankings. So one set related to Beijing's influence efforts, and then one, the local response and resilience. In terms of the countries that had the highest targeting by the broadest array of tactics, not surprisingly, Taiwan was number 1, and then the US, and then the UK. But it's when you get into the next tier of countries that are still facing very high or high levels of influence efforts from Beijing that you really see the global scope. So that's countries like Nigeria, the Philippines, Argentina, Spain, Italy. It's not just necessarily countries where there's either fairly hostile relations with the Chinese government or where there's a long track record of these kinds of influence efforts.
So would you say a lot of these are sort of wedge countries that, they can be, shifted away from the U.S. sphere of influence?
Partly that, or partly, sometimes it depends. It's not clear that they would necessarily super strategic in selecting these countries. A lot of it might have to do with particular ambassadors who are especially aggressive or especially savvy in the media space. It has to do with, say, China Radio International and how savvy and influential it is in the local media space, including on social media as well. And it honestly has to do with local actors too, because it depends on whether local journalists on media outlets are willingly, accepting these content sharing agreements, or in countries like Chile, I think, Colombia, where they were rejecting it. So it kind of depends also. There's very much that element of whether local actors are collaborating or not.
And just a moment, I'd like to point out that Alibaba is a great source for all of your needs. Check out
What kind of needs?
All of your needs.
Okay.
What about my need for love?
No.
My deep-seated
It
need to
can
be
provide
loved.
you with devices for physical love.
No, that's not what I'm talking about, Chris.
So
This is how it goes off the rails.
it's
Very
too
quickly.
early for that. I was actually going to ask if you guys looked at Chinese diaspora media in these countries, or if it was mostly focused on local language media.
It was mostly focused on local language media, but we did look at Chinese diaspora media, and you really do see in a lot of places very heavy influence from Beijing. A lot of the only media is controlled by the Chinese government, with outlets and individuals going to China for various Chinese world media forums and things like that. And WeChat, the app that Tencent owns and is heavily censored in China, playing a very strong role outside of China as well. And one of the things that was interesting with WeChat that we found, and this is a little technical, but basically if you want to like create an account that's not a personal account outside China, but is an account that, let's say you're a news outlet and you want to broadcast to local members of the, or, you know, of the local Chinese community, the way it's set up, there isn't really that functionality for international accounts. You kind of have to set it up the way it would be set up in China and be subject to that full range of politicized censorship. So you have a situation where even diaspora outlets that might want to be more critical end up having to self-select because what content they're sharing, because they'd otherwise be censored by WeChat and just have the account shut down.
I guess I was also wondering whether there was any kind of correlation between diaspora media influence and local media influence in terms of, I guess I'm thinking, because you mentioned Italy and there's like a large Chinese diaspora in Italy, and I'm thinking about how they can do things like have an infrastructure set up to influence the local Chinese diaspora, and whether there's ways to kind of use that system to influence local media or, you know, officials, that kind of thing.
You're talking about like the neighborhood associations and like the tongs and like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. It seemed like in most places, the Chinese language media sector was still pretty isolated from the mainstream media sector. If anything, you had in a number of countries mainstream outlets that were translating into Chinese. And so Italy wasn't one of these cases, but countries like the US, like Australia, like the UK that have, or Malaysia, that have relatively robust Chinese communities were actually some of the ones that had independent Chinese language media. Because you had mainstream media that were also translating into Chinese, PBC Chinese, but you also had some local outlets created by activists or dissidents or just those who are critical of the CCP. So it was actually Hong Kongers that are coming over. There was just actually a more diverse Chinese language ecosystem in those countries than in countries that had a smaller diaspora, and where it was a little bit easier or medium size for the CCP to influence it. I think you do see in some countries, maybe Italy, maybe South Africa, maybe, you know, where there's influence in the broader Chinese community or attempts to influence. And then if you have individuals who get more engaged in the local political system, like MPs and things like that, then that's where the influence can manifest. But it gets really tricky because then you also have concerns over racism and whether that's legitimate. And it gets, and so you kind of saw both sides of the coin with that. But for the most part, I would say, even in terms of their influence efforts, they definitely want to get a strong foothold in the Chinese language community. But the dynamics in the broader mainstream language are usually pretty different. There might even be different parts of the Chinese media and propaganda apparatus that are operating in the different languages.